Welcome back to Proxhammer, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at the new point changes to the Craftworld Eldar in the Nephilim expansion. And we're going to be looking at if we're actually still viable as a competitive army. I've been talking to a lot of my fellow Eldar players in my local gaming group and in my area, and a lot of them seem to think, falsely, that the Eldar are completely finished as far as the competitive scene. And what I mean by that is, for those of you who haven't been playing Eldar that long, Eldar are a swing faction. That means that they've gone through so many big swings in competitive play that a lot of the time, the Craftworld Eldar seem at some points very weak in competitive play and at sometimes extremely strong. An example that I would give would be a champion in I don't know if any of you play League of Legends, but I used to play. It'd be kind of like a champion like, I don't know, Nasus or something, right? Not a lot of people play Nasus, but there's times where Nasus is really overpowered. And then there's times where Nasus isn't so good and no one really plays him except for really dedicated players that love the champion. And that's exactly what Craftworld Eldar were for a long time. Now, I started playing this game in 3rd edition, but I really only started playing competitively in 5th edition. And what I can tell you is that in 5th edition, Eldar were using a 4th edition codex for a long time. We had a 2006 codex for basically forever. So I think we've gotten really used to all the fancy new tools and things that we have in this new codex, and now the GW has taken away some of those and reined those back a little bit. We're starting to, have basically growing pains, right? It's like, this is how I would see it. When I was playing the Craftworld Eldar during our last codex, and I don't know if any of you remember, but that last codex was pretty awful. It had a lot of really outdated units in it, and the special rules were really bad, most of them. And a lot of our power came from really, honestly, a lot of tips and little tricks and things like that, like moving Dark Reapers in and out of Falcons and Wave Serpents using Fire and Fade, Swooping Hawks using their little grenade pack, basically gimmick, which they would move over a unit multiple times to inflict multiple mortar wounds in a turn, and things like that. So I think that, honestly, I was still winning games with that army, with that codex. And yes, I'm not the most competitive tournament player out there. Honestly, just to be honest with you guys, I don't really participate in that many grand tournaments, but I'm going to have to tell you guys, I've looked at the changes many times now, at least from the points perspective. And from the points perspective, I don't think it's actually that bad. It is a good hit. It's a decent hit to our units. We're going to have to tighten our belts a little bit with this, but I don't think it's something that's going to kill the army at all. So for all you Craftworld Eldar players who just got into Craftworld Eldar and now, kind of sad about it, that they got nerfed and maybe thinking of starting a new army or whatever, jumping ship, so to speak. I've met plenty of players who have done this over the years. I would wait off a little bit because, to be honest with you, Craftworld Eldar is still extremely powerful, and I would still probably rank them in solid mid-tier to even high tier, depending on how much skill as a player you have. So, honestly, are we still viable as a competitive army? I think we are, and I think we're still going to probably not sweep the tournament scene, but at least get some placements in tournaments. And I think you guys will see this in the coming months, that we'll at least get some placements in those GTs. So what we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at the various points increases to our units in War Gear, and there are a lot. We're going to be looking at how this will impact most Eldar lists. I'm going to give you a before and after look of one of my own lists, one of the basic lists that I kind of came up with in the beginning, and just give you a before and after look at it and what changed. And we're going to be talking about, are Craftworld Eldar still a competitive faction, even after all of the point changes? So here's the thing. Almost every Craftworld Eldar and Ynnari character got about a 5 to 20 point increase. Now, a lot of you are going to say, oh my god, that's terrible, right? Every character got one. But the thing is, luckily, we don't use that many characters in our list, right? On average, it'll probably cost most Craftworld Eldar players about 15 to 20 points. And this could be more if you're using more expensive HQs like Phoenix Lords or the Avatars. But in general, I think this is going to be a slight detriment and not a complete huge nerf, right? So let's look at Farseers for example. Farseers both got increased by 5 points. Now, most lists are going to run 3 Farseers, or 2 Farseers and an Autarch. That's only going to be a 15-point increase in your list. That's not that detrimental, and considering how much power Farseers are enjoying, it really doesn't come as a surprise to me that they chose to target Farseers with a slight points nerf. And it's only 5 points. The war gear that they can take didn't increase. You're not seeing the Farseer Skyrunner, jump up to 150 points or something ridiculous like that, which honestly something like that has happened in the past. You'd be surprised. So I think we probably got off a little bit lucky on the Farseers because they could have honestly been increased by 10 points and it would have been a little justified. And with the Autarch Skyrunner, I know people weren't really running this one. It did get increased by 5 points. I don't think it's that big of a deal, to be honest. Just because it is a very powerful support HQ with good melee power, and it was often overshadowed by Farseers, and I can see why people would say, well, why did they nerf the Autarch if the Farseers are the problem? But Autarchs are powerful too, and I've used them in several games. They've been quite effective for me. I know that. So, honestly, not really a big nerf there. Same thing with the Foot Autarch. The Foot Autarch got increased by 5 points, but all of the war gear stayed basically the same. And if you look at it, right, all the war gear is the same cost. They're still overshadowed by Farseers, in my opinion, who are much more versatile in match play. So I don't think we're going to see Autarchs more because of the nerf. But, I do think that, to be honest with you, the nerfs weren't that bad when it came to HQ choices. Most HQ choices, anyway. Now, the Spirit Seer is one that I found a bit confusing. And this is where I started to kind of think, okay, maybe GW overstepped on some of this stuff. Because I could see why they nerfed Farseers and Autarchs a little bit. But Spirit Seers? Spirit Seer is really only viable with Wraith armies and Wraith units. So I was a little bit uncertain about this increase. And it did kind of get me thinking that maybe GW just used a really heavy hand on everything in the Eldar Codex that had a psychic power. And this kind of made sense to me because I was like, well, psychic powers are very powerful, Eldar psychic powers. The Spirit Seer, however, can only cast 1 psychic power a turn. So honestly, I don't think that this nerf was actually justified. But all in all, I don't think a lot of people used Spirit Seers unless they were running a Wraith army, and most Wraith units stayed the same cost. Actually, every single Wraith unit stayed the same cost. So it's not going to be that much of a detriment to your army. Typically, you're only going to take one of these anyway, so it's only going to be a 5-point increase, but still a little bit confusing to understand why. Now, all the Ynnari models also got a points increase. The Vizarch, which is basically an upgraded Autarch, got a 5-point increase. Your Vrain got basically increased by 5 points, and the Ykaran got increased by 10. And it makes sense. It makes sense considering the rest of the nerfs, but I think the Vizarch might be the odd man out here. I'm not sure he warranted a 5-point increase because he was already a little bit more expensive than an Autarch on foot anyway, but at least he's not Prince Riel, right? Who also got a 5-point increase. Now, again, I understand that they increased the cost of Autarchs, and he's an Autarch. But it's funny because he was probably one of the weakest Autarchs because he had no options. And basically, he was Iyanden locked. So you couldn't take him in anything but Iyanden lists. And Iyanden lists typically, to be honest, aren't that good with Prince Riel. Really not that great. Outside of, using a lot of Corsairs, I don't really see much of a point to using them over a normal Autarch. Now, when we look at the Phoenix Lords, Azurman got a 10-point increase. Basically, every Phoenix Lord got a cost increase, regardless of their actual ability. So even with the nerf to Azurman, I think he'll still find a place in good casual lists. He's a good Phoenix Lord, he's just not the best, and probably not going to be used in anything super competitive. So I think this points increase is not the worst. But when we look at some of the other Phoenix Lords, we can see that they got pretty much the same treatment, right? All three of these, Janezar, Kahandras, and Mengu-Ra, all got a 10-point increase. I think Mengu-Ra is especially disappointing considering how weak he was as a Phoenix Lord in the first place. I think he was probably one of the lower tiers of Phoenix Lords. And the fact that they just nerfed him and nerfed his points like that kind of left a bad taste in my mouth, because I was like, man, they really don't like these weak Phoenix Lords, the underperforming Phoenix Lords. And same thing with Fuegan. Underperforming Phoenix Lord, very honestly terrible, in my opinion. Never really found a lot of success with him. And I've not seen him a single time in any real list except in my bad list contest. So I was very confused by the increase in points. But, I mean, hey, I get it. They were just going to blanket cost increase everything in the Phoenix Lord section. So same thing with Barath. Now, Barath was actually a 20-point increase. Now, I thought these guys were going to nerf Barath for sure. I thought he was going to get increased by 10 points. Now, I think he's still going to be used in the competitive scene. I think he's still good. I don't think anyone was really surprised that this guy got a points buff, or excuse me, not a points buff, a points nerf. And I think he's still going to be relied on in competitive play for his just great hit and run abilities and objective control. The Avatar of Cain is another one that got a 10-point increase. I think this is okay. Although, to be honest with you, I suppose that since everything costs more, there's going to be less points for units like the Avatar. And if you had an Avatar of Cain in your list, most likely you're going to be thinking about ways to either cut costs in your army otherwise or just cut the Avatar altogether. I think units like the Avatar are actually going to be a lot harder to field. Not that the Avatar is bad or anything. I think the Avatar of Cain is still a great model. I just think it's going to be harder to fit into lists. I think players are going to have to get a little more creative with how they plan to support the Avatar of Cain. Now, in addition to that, nearly all Aspect Warriors got a slight points increase. So with the exception of Dark Reapers and Shining Spears, all aspects got increased by about 1 to 2 points. And this is a significant overall nerf to armies fielding a lot of Aspect Warriors. And we can see here, Dire Avengers, Fire Dragons, Howling Banshees, and Striking Scorpions all got a 1-point increase. And I think here it's more of the heavy hand, right? I don't think Fire Dragons and Howling Banshees really needed the nerf. But I also think that Dire Avengers and Striking Scorpions probably did need a slight points increase. So again, this is me agreeing with GW on some stuff, and on some stuff saying, I think you were a bit heavy-handed here. Now, Warp Spiders got increased by 2 points a model. And this makes them a lot more expensive to field in big units, and I honestly think that they're still very viable, but as a smaller unit for Web of Deceit and Spider's Lair kind of shenanigans. And I have a video on this, and I think they're still very good at doing that. I just don't think they're going to be a heavy damage dealing unit anymore for their points cost, because you have to take into account that in a 10-man unit, you're going to be paying 20 more points. And that may not seem like a lot, but that could, that's an extra Warp Spider, essentially, that you have to get rid of in your list. So if you had 10 Warp Spiders, you're going to have 9 Warp Spiders. That's a loss of 10% of its firepower of the unit. Well, probably 9% because the Exarch has 2 weapons, but still, right? That's a significant amount of firepower lost there. However, when we move on to Swooping Hawks, they got increased by 2 points as model, 2 points per model as well. And I think this was probably justified due to the fact that they can just hide the entire game while still being able to do damage, still being able to disrupt and be a great objective control unit. I think this unit is still pretty much an auto-include for a lot of competitive lists that want to do very well on objectives just because of how versatile and powerful they are in the objective game. And our vehicles got nerfed too. Falcons, Wave Serpents, Fire Prisms all got a 5-point increase, in addition to the Vectored Engines nerf being increased by 10 points. So Vectored Engines is now 20 points. Now, depending on how many of these vehicles you have in your list, this could add up to a decent amount of points. And for example, I have one of my lists in particular has 6 vehicles in it, and that's a 30-point swing. That's a 30-point nerf. So could be pretty significant. So the Falcon got increased by 5 points, and this was a fairly small nerf just in and of itself. But I never really found myself using Vectored Engines, I have to admit. And I suspect the nerf to Vectored Engines basically just went hand in hand with the nerfs to Matchless Agility and the Fire and Fade ability being nerfed as well, which they have been nerfed, and I will talk about those in a future video. And this was just to limit our use of the move, shoot, move abilities that we all know and love from Eldar, and probably the reason why a lot of us play Eldar. Now, what some of you might not know is that back in the day, we never had this ability. Eldar never really had something like Battle Focus before 6th edition. And I know this very well, and trust me, there are ways of getting around that and still being able to be an effective army without having as much of that. And we still have a little bit of it, so it's not that big of a deal, but it is still a big hit for a lot of our units, including the Fire Prism, by the way. Now, the Fire Prism, I think probably the points increase is warranted because it was so effective against the previous top factions, Tau, Tyranid, and things like that, and Imperial Knights. And it has amazing damage with linked fire, being able to ignore invul saves. I think the 5-point increase was probably a little bit warranted on this in general. The Vectored Engines nerf does kind of suck for those of you who wanted to use that to keep your Fire Prism safe, but you're going to have to pay a little more points for it, unfortunately. Now, as for dedicated transports, Wave Serpents also got a 5-point hike. This is probably one of the ones that I didn't agree with, along with the Night Spinner, that should have gotten a points increase, in my opinion. I never really thought Wave Serpents were this, Destroyer of Worlds kind of transport. And I think they're a decent transport, probably one of the better ones in the game, but not good enough to warrant a points nerf, in my opinion. If you're not also going to nerf the Night Spinner, which, to be honest with you, Night Spinner is probably kind of more in the dumps now, even more so with the new changes. I really don't think people will go back to the Night Spinner. I think a 5-point increase on Fire Prisms, most people are just going to take that points increase on the head, and they're just going to accept it and make cuts elsewhere because Fire Prisms are very powerful, especially against a lot of the armies out there. You just really need that linked fire ability to cut through tanks. Now, the Rangers war gear also got nerfed. The Gloomfield and the Wireweave nets both got a 5-point increase. I think this will make both upgrades a lot less desirable. I thought they were worth 5 points. I don't think they're worth 10. Because you're going to have less room to throw these in if you have extra points anyway. And that's kind of what I was using them as for the most part. I know that in the competitive scene, a lot of people were using Wireweave nets and so forth, which were effective. But I don't think these are really that necessary. And I think probably it's going to be one of the first things people cut from their list to save points. Again, they're nice to have, but they were never necessary or essential in my mind, and I think people are still going to use these in the competitive scene very heavily, and they're still going to be the optimal troop choice, regardless of whether or not the Gloomfield and the Wireweave net were nerfed. So I still think Rangers are going to be probably the premier choice for troops. Now, this one threw me for a little bit of a loop, to be honest. Literally, this one threw me for a tailspin, if you know what I mean. Our Flyers got a 5-point increase. And I suppose they were just a little too OP for GW's liking. I don't know. They were definitely in all the tournaments. They were definitely just crushing the competition out there. Tyranids didn't stand a chance against, the Harpy. What Harpy? We have these Flyers, right? So they got a 5-point increase because obviously the Crimson Hunter and the Hemlock Wraith Fighter were so OP that, no one could really stop them, right? So they got a 5-point increase. And obviously I'm being sarcastic with all of this. I think these guys were probably the worst models in the Codex in general. I wasn't a big fan of these, but they didn't need a points hike. And to be honest with you, I liked running a couple of them in fun games, but The points on this felt really unnecessary. And I think that if you're not going to increase something like the Doom Spinner, or the Night Spinner, and you're going to increase our flyers, there's something a little bit off with that. Because they really didn't need a point hike at all. But, again, not a lot of people use these, so I think this nerf is going to fly under the radar for a lot of people. But in essence, it probably was just kind of a heavy-handed move by GW. So, on to Wind Riders. Now, Wind Riders got a slight point increase on their scatter laser upgrade by about 5 points. So this makes the scatter laser a little more expensive, but I still think it's a very effective weapon. And honestly, I saw this coming a little bit because I saw the amount of power that scatter lasers were getting. Just being able to stay safe, being able to stay behind terrain almost the entire game with battle focus, and it was just a very good combination in general. So scatter lasers got brought up to the same cost as shuriken cannons on these guys, and I think that has largely to do with the fact that Wind Riders have battle focus and can very easily pop out of terrain, shoot at a very long range, and then pop back in, and the enemy units don't really have a lot of chance to fight back. I think that's probably why they did it. And I think this goes with the whole scheme that GW has of limiting our abilities to do those kind of maneuvers. And by that, I mean being able to move, shoot, and then move back into terrain or behind terrain. So we have a few Exarch powers that got an increase in points as well. It's not a big deal, but we got Stand Firm, which is a Dire Avenger power that gives them objective secured. That got a 5-point increase, and then Heartstrike got a 5-point increase for Shining Spears, which is probably the more confusing nerf to me. But, it's not that big of a deal at the end of the day. So, as far as the Exarch powers, Stand Firm gets a 5-point increase, which is understandable because objective secured on Dire Avengers for only 10 points was a little bit too strong to miss. It was a little bit too good. So that got increased by 5 points, which made sense to me considering how many people are running Dire Avengers in the grand tournaments and things like that with Hail of Doom. So probably a little bit too much versatility there for just 10 points, but it still does essentially the same thing. Now, for Striking Scorpions, Swooping Hawks, and Warp Spiders, all of their Exarch powers remain exactly the same. They got no nerfs, so no points increases there, which is really good because, to be honest with you, I find that the Striking Scorpions especially have really mediocre, except for Crushing Blow, have really mediocre Exarch powers. So I'm glad they didn't increase the cost of any of those. Luckily, they only increased the points cost of the unit, right? And same goes for the Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders. Now, when we get to the Fire Dragons, Howling Banshees, and Shining Spears, I'm glad they didn't touch Fire Dragons or Howling Banshees again because they already nerfed their points once, right? But with the Shining Spears, the Heartstrike gets a 5-point increase, and I'm not sure exactly what justification this had, as I can really only see it being really effective with the Paragon Saber. But it did get increased in points, unfortunately, to 20 points from 15, and that was a little bit of a bummer to see. So how will these point changes actually affect our list? So I'm going to give you a before and after example of one of these lists that I ran before the nerfs. And your own lists might vary greatly. Some of your lists might not even take that big of a hit, but it just depends what's in it. Now, what I will say is that in a lot of lists, you are going to see a significant impact. But what does that actually translate to on the paper? So this is basically how the nerfs translate on paper. So here for HQ for this list, I have an Autarch Skyrunner, which was 100 points, a Farseer Skyrunner for 120 points, and another Farseer Skyrunner for 120 points. So those made up my HQ slots before, and that was pre-nerf. For troops, I had 3 units of Rangers. 2 units of Rangers had the Wire Weave Nets. They were usually the front runners that would go out and, be near the enemy deployment zone and things like that. And I always had 1 Rangers in the backfield. So, again, 70 points for 5 Rangers with Wire Weave Nets and 65 points if they didn't have Wire Weave Nets. For elites, I had 2 full units of Dire Avengers, of course. One had the Shredding Fire ability. The other one had the Stand Firm ability, which got nerfed. I had 2 Wraith Lords with Shuriken Cannons, Shuriken Catapults, and the Ghost Glaive for support. And I had 2 units of fire dragons. One of them had the Blazing Fury Exarch power, and this was just in a gambit to get around things like Auspex scan and things like that. For fast attack, I had 5 Shining Spears, and the Exarch had a Shuriken Cannon, Heart Strike, which got a 5-point nerf, and the Paragon Saber. And the Paragon Saber, in my opinion, was a really great tool with the Heart Strike ability and could deal a lot of significant mortal wounds. For heavy support, I had 2 Falcons. They had a Pulse Laser, a Twin Shuriken Catapult, and a Shuriken Cannon. These came in at 145 points, and their goal was to Cloud Strike with the Fire Dragons in one of the first turns of the game. And these also got a slight points increase. I also had 2 Wave Serpents carrying the Dire Avengers, of course. They had a Twin Linked Shuriken Cannon each, and they came in at 140 points apiece. So the old total came out to just 2,000 points. And I was able to fit a lot in there while still being able to fit in some upgrades. And of course, I didn't show it here, but I also had a lot of relics and things like that as well, which had to be cut down, of course, because of the command point changes. So my HQ section got increased by about 15 points. All 3 options increased: Autarch Skyrunner, Farseer Skyrunner, and my second Farseer Skyrunner all increased by 5 points. My troops got increased by about 10 points with the Wireweave nets being increased by 5 points apiece. So I had 2 of those, so that's going to be plus 10 points for my troops. My elites got increased by quite a bit, by about 35 points, because of the nerf to Dire Avengers, Stand Firm, the Fire Dragons as well, being increased by 5 points basically per unit. So these guys got a significant nerf in the elite section, and the swing is about 35 points worth of stuff. For fast attack, Heart Strike got nerfed by 5 points, so just 5 points, but still nothing that's, to be honest with you, I thought that Heart Strike shouldn't have gotten nerfed, but it did get increased by 5 points here as well. For heavy support, both Falcons got increased by 5 points for a total of 10 points extra. And for dedicated transport, both Wave Serpents also got nerfed by 5 points, which is a 10-point increase as well. So the new total is 2,085 points. This is with the changes. So in other words, we need to cut 85 points out of our army. So luckily, most of these points were upgrades in the list that can be dropped without too much trouble. The Wireweave nets can be dropped for 20 points. Blazing Fury can be dropped for 25 points. The Falcon with the Shuriken Cannons can go down to Scatter Lasers for 10 points. Heart Strike can be removed for 20 points. And Shredding Fire can be removed for 25 points. So those are a lot of hits to the power of a lot of our units. But it's something that we don't need to have, right? We don't need to have things like Blazing Fury and Shredding Fire. They do help quite a bit, and they do add a lot of damage, but they're not necessary for the unit to be effective. Now, this was about 100 points worth of drops. So maybe we have a little bit of extra points to give the Falcons back their Shuriken Cannons. So, with all those changes, are Craftworld Eldar still going to be a competitive faction? I have to admit, it's a lot, right? 85 points to cut out of a list is quite a lot, and some of you may have a little bit more than that, depending, or a little less. And although I think we're still going to be a really powerful faction, probably, I think high mid-tier, just because of the fact that our faction is so specialized and we have such great units at killing certain targets, I think we're definitely going to have a lot less toys and upgrades to play with in our lists. This, combined with the several nerfs to our most commonly used stratagems, including Fire and Fade and Matchless Agility, which I will talk about in another video, just not this video, is probably going to hurt us a fair bit. But I don't think it's going to sink us completely. And I have to say, again, I think that while we're probably not the most overpowered army in 40k at the moment, we're definitely still very strong. So, with all the changes and nerfs, is there actually any good news about the Eldar? Well, there's a couple of things that are both good news. One of the things is that both Tau and Tyranids, who are our toughest matchups, essentially, just got nerfed really hard as well. Tyranid warriors, Maleceptors, winged hive tyrants, Raveners, and things like that all got points nerfs just like Tau did. Tau got battlesuit nerfs all across the board. Drones got increased in cost. Ethereals, I believe, also got increased in cost. So Tau have had a lot of nerfs as well, and so have Tyranid. And those were our toughest matchups, I think, for Craftworld Eldar. Since those factions have also been brought down quite a bit, I think in general, we're going to be in a slightly better place because of that. Now, I wouldn't be having such a cheery disposition if Tau and Tyranid were basically unchanged. But since they're nerfed as well, I just feel that they're still going to be on the same level as we are. And honestly, in my opinion, I think Tau got hit a little harder than Eldar because a lot of people in the competitive scene were just running pure suit armies, and those suit armies are going to cost a lot more now. You're going to see Tau players making a lot of adjustments. The second point is that Warlocks, Guardians, Wraithlords, support weapons, as well as a slew of other units are looking a lot better by comparison. And yes, these units are all great with the Uthway Craftworld. And something me and my friend who plays Craftworld Eldar, he actually plays Uthway, we were talking about the other day is the return of Uthway. And I think Uthway is going to be resurgent now because they basically got almost no nerfs except for Farseers. All of their great units didn't get touched. Warlocks, Guardians, Wraithlords, support weapons, all are extremely well with Uthway and didn't get touched at all with nerfs. So those of you out here who play Uthway, count your blessings because to be honest with you, I think a lot more people are going to be looking at Uthway a lot more as a competitive Eldar faction. So in conclusion, I think we took a lot of small hits that together will probably account for about 5 to 10% of our lists point-wise. For some of us, though, this may be much less, like my Uthway friend who only got his list increased by 15 points, which was because of his 3 Farseers. So I think despite the nerf, I'm still a really firm believer that Craftworld Eldar will still be a high mid-tier faction in the coming months as players tinker and refocus their lists. A lot of players out there that I had heard as reviews were saying that the Eldar were destroyed in tournament scene and that you weren't going to see any Eldar tournament winners for, until the new expansion comes out and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, to be honest with you, I read the reviews and they seemed a little biased. And maybe this is because they either don't play Eldar that much or they simply, are overreacting. I think Eldar is still going to be very strong. Do I think they're going to be an S-tier faction in tournaments, winning every single GT out there? Absolutely not. I don't think that. But I think we're going to see some solid placements in several of the GTs still. I think that Eldar are a faction that is going to compete, especially since Tyranids and Tau, which were the front runners in the competitive scene for the Xenos, also got a pretty significant nerf. Some would argue that they got nerfed harder than Eldar, in my opinion. And I think they actually did get nerfed a lot harder because of the competitive armies that were being played in GTs. Whereas the Eldar factions, yes, we got a lot of nerfs, but our main units remained really strong. And honestly, like I said, Dire Avengers, they did get a bit of a nerf, but it wasn't a huge nerf. They got nerfed by about 10 points per unit. And just think about it this way. A Tyranid warrior unit got nerfed by 30 points a unit, whereas a Dire Avenger unit only got nerfed by 10 points a unit. So, honestly, I think compared to Tyranid and Tau, we got off a little bit easy. Also, by the way, suits got increased by an insane amount of points. I believe they got increased by 10 points a suit. So that's pretty insane. So yeah, we did get off a little bit easy compared to those two factions, in my opinion. All right, everybody. That's going to be it for today's video. I hope you guys aren't too bummed out by the Eldar nerfs. Honestly, I was a little bit bummed out at first, but I think we're going to come out of this fine. And I think just give players time to retinker and refocus their lists. And I think you'll find that when you're playing against, your fellow Warhammer players, that not a lot has changed. Hopefully. Outside of the very competitive tournament scene, I think you'll find that, you're going to be doing all right. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that even in the GTs, Eldar will have some sort of showing and some sort of placement within those tournaments. All right, everybody, that's it for today. I have a future video coming out on the special rule changes, which are probably a little bit more detrimental than the point changes. And we'll look at those in a future video. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out. See you guys later. Oh, and feel free to leave any comments on your thoughts on the nerfs. I'd really like to hear your input on those. All right, have a good one.